Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to talk about research ethics, which is not always the most exciting topic in research to talk about, but it is really foundational to being able to do good research. And you're going to see in a lot of the examples that we have folks that maybe didn't do such great research, at least from an ethical perspective. So let's jump right in. So, the first one we're going to talk about is the Stanford Prison Experiment. You may or may not have heard of it before, but the the basic idea behind this behind the Stanford Prison Experiment, or really the TLDR, is how fast does power change people. So, as we go through some of this, I wanted you to keep that in mind. So, if we look at some of the key facts of the experiment, basically the overarching idea of the experiment was at Stanford, this professor, Phil Zimbardo, designed a study because he was interested in why there was so much antagonism between prison guards and prisoners. And so he designed this experiment and went to the extent of having kids be fake arrested and then put into jail, with some of them being prisoners and others being guards. Now, the study just like went off the rails almost immediately because like within 24 hours, guards were inventing punishments without being told to. Some of the prisoners began showing acute stress reactions like crying, rage, withdrawal. There was a ton of distress. One participant had to be released early due to emotional collapse. And the study was actually planned for 2 weeks, but it ended after 6 days. On the slide before, there's a link to a documentary that you can watch. It's a Nat Geo documentary about the Stanford Prison Experiment, and it actually does interviews with some of the folks that participated. And you know, like I mentioned, that this research question was drawn from observations of antagonistic behavior between guards and prisoners. But some of the facts that aren't often discussed. The principal investigator, Phil Zimbardo, became the prison superintendent, not just the researcher. So if we think about conflict of interest, like who was protecting the participants, because he in essence became a participant. So there was a visiting psychologist, Christina Maslach, who basically is the reason that this study got stopped. So it was really only stopped because an outsider intervened. Now, participants technically consented, but could they really withdraw freely? The takeaway is that this study wasn't about bad people. It was really about how quickly roles can override identity. Now, would this study pass an IRB today? Not just no, but probably hell no. Like, absolutely not. Like, there's no way this would even make it anywhere. But if we're also looking at, like, part of the reason this experiment gets talked about so much is that it really did provide this perspective around behavior that we might consider evil or dominant or aggressive. And if we think about, that perspective that was really gained, that like really anybody is capable of anything, how does this connect to hazing in college settings, in the military? How might it affect? How might it be related to workplace hierarchies? People get in power; they have power over people, and we've all worked for that boss or two that's just like we feel like is just a mad person, especially when they feel like they're being challenged. Think about police misconduct. I mean, this is pretty relevant right in the here and now. Not to, I don't say that to provide an excuse in any way for violent and abusive behavior, because that's always unacceptable. And this is also a lens to maybe be able to view. Also, think about prison abuse scandals. This was really actually, and you'll probably see in the documentary if you watch it, that Phil Zimbardo actually testified on behalf of the defense during the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, which, for those of you that aren't aware, like, there in Iraq and Abu Ghraib, there was a detention center, and the guards photographed themselves and each other abusing and torturing prisoners, and it became a really, really huge deal. And those folks were actually put on trial because of the abuses that they perpetrated in that setting. So, although this study was integral to providing perspective into why people are capable of violence and control, there are a couple of considerations. There are a lot of criticisms on the findings because of potential conflicts of interest. Phil Zimbardo wasn't an objective observer of this study. He was involved, he had a vested interest in it. And I think that, there's a lot of folks that actually make the case that it affected some of his interpretations and the way that he maybe almost saw what he wanted to see. Often this study is reductive as to the myriad of factors influencing antisocial, violent, and dominant behaviors, because this really talks to power and the power of roles and the influence that power and roles can have on folks. And so I think it sometimes offers a really simplistic explanation for something that's actually probably a lot more complex. If you think of terms of generalizability, sample size, replicability, what critiques come up? Small sample size. There weren't a lot of people that were involved. It was the study was stopped before it even finished. The study's never really been done again, and rightfully so. It probably shouldn't. But we also don't have the opportunity to really replicate any of the findings. So, well, to go back to the Stanford Prison Experiment, there's probably going to be a question on the exam about this. So maybe make sure that you're familiar. But if we look at the ethics of research, really it's about protecting participants from physical and mental harm. That as researchers, we have a duty and responsibility to do this. And we're going to see how a lot of these studies that were really not ethical in nature led us to prioritizing that. We're also going to talk about the right of participants to privacy regarding their behavior, the assurance that participation in research is completely voluntary, and the necessity of informing participants about the nature of procedures before their participation in the experiment. Here's another one. Milgram's obedience experiment. Now, these are pretty famous, so you probably have heard about these before. But I want to go through them as well and really talk about some of the impact, and because I think in the larger discourse, there's a lot of stuff that gets missed about what this study was, what it proved, and what it means. It was about the study of a phenomenon of obedience to an authority figure. It really examined the effects of punishment on learning. So participants receive shock treatment for making mistakes. And the results challenge beliefs that are about our ability to resist authority. And this study is really pointed to a lot for as important for understanding obedience in real life situations such as the Holocaust. You can watch this recreation of the Milgram experiment. The video is 11 minutes long. It's worth a watch. Um, so if we if we break down the experiment and frame it in terms of, would you actually refuse to administer shock treatment? The one thing I'll say on the slide before is that nobody was actually receiving shocks. There were Confederates in the other room that were making it sound like they were receiving shocks. So the people that were administering the punishment shocks thought that there was really harm coming to the Confederates. So 65% of the participants delivered what they believed were lethal shocks, that basically they believed that they were delivering incredible, like, mortal uh, harm. And we find that the participants weren't sadistic. Many of them were sweating profusely, shaking uncontrollably, nervously laughing, and like begging to stop. But the most dangerous words in the experiment were not shock. And this is the thing I really want you to take with you and to drive home. The most powerful part of it was the phrase, the experiment requires that you continue. Think about that. It's it it's a way of separating what someone is actually doing and having the position of and that coming from a position of authority. It creates this disconnect. At no point are they saying like continue to shock the other person, but just that the experiment requires your participation and for you to continue. So what makes this study really unsettling and maybe a little bit interesting is that the authority figure wasn't threatening. They were just calm, professional, and confident. And so participants actually believed that they were helping science. And obedience actually increased when authority was physically present, responsibility felt diffused. And what I mean by that is that there was, it felt like if I'm administering the shock, I'm not the one responsible for administering the shock. It's like I'm being told that I have to do this. And when the victim felt psychologically distant. So if we think about some of the real world connection, like I mentioned before, Holocaust compliance, something that Milgram explicitly referenced, military obedience, medical errors when nurses follow doctors despite doubts, and if you think to corporate scandals where everyone was just doing their job. This is where we really find the application of Milgram's study. The question to consider is really, at what point do you think you would stop? And what evidence do you actually have for that belief? So, another, I guess, if we think about these studies individually, there's no way they would be able to pass an IRB. But let's also think of what led to the IRB, and it's the Belmont report. And it's it is the result of these studies in particular. But the Belmont report was a reaction, not a rule book. The Belmont report wasn't abstract. It was a response to harm based on Nazi medical experiments. The Tuskegee syphilis study, which we're going to find here in a second, is really the trigger that led to the Belmont report. Also, the Stanford Prison Experiment and Milgram's finding. Belmont exists because researchers realized good intentions were not good enough to protect participants. So if we look at the historical timeline, the immediate trigger was the Tuskegee syphilis study from 1932 to 1972. And some key facts that shocked the public were that Black men with syphilis were not informed of their diagnosis. This was a study that was carried out over 40 years, and at many points, treatment was deliberately withheld even after penicillin became available. So there was intentional harm to these research participants. And so when this became public in 1972, it caused massive public outrage, congressional hearings, a collapse of trust in medical and psychological research. And so as a response, Congress passed the National Research Act. This law created the National Commission. It required the development of ethical principles and mandated institutional oversight, IRBs, institutional review boards. Remember the Belmont Report because it might be on the exam. And what your tendency is going to be is what followed is going to be to answer what followed after the Belmont Report. So if you're listening to this lecture, keep in mind that this is a very, very important concept and a very, very important topic. So the Belmont Report established respect for persons, protecting the autonomy of all people and treating them with courtesy and respect and allowing for informed consent. It focused on the concept of beneficence, maximizing benefits for the research project while minimizing risk to the research subjects, and justice, ensuring reasonable, non-exploitative, and well-considered procedures are administered fairly. The fair distribution of costs and benefits to potential research participants. You can watch a short video on the Belmont Report. It's about 9 minutes long, and you can access it by clicking the link on this slide. But the reason Belmont Report had real enforcement power is because it leveraged funding. So institutions must comply in order to receive money. And non-compliance can result in loss of grants, suspension of studies, institutional sanctions. This made ethics a structural requirement, not an option. Institutional review boards. Belmont principles were operationalized through IRBs. IRBs are required by federal law. They're required to provide independent review, and they have the authority to approve, require modification, and reject studies outright. So IRBs are really the local enforcers of Belmont values. Legal liability. So if you fail to follow Belmont, can lead to civil lawsuits, loss of accreditation, federal investigations, and professional discipline to researchers. So in other words, ethical violations became legal risks too. And it also created this cultural shift in science. It changed the norms of research. Informed consent became non-negotiable. Vulnerable populations gained explicit protections, and deception required justification and briefing. So part of the critique of the Milgram study was that there was no debriefing afterwards. So people left thinking that they had caused harm to other people, and they were never informed, or they weren't informed until probably much later than they should have been, that they actually weren't causing harm to people. So Belmont really shifted research from can we do this, like can we study this, to should we and who decides and how do we protect folks. I'm going to stop this video there because I know we're running on a little bit of time. I'm going to do a part 2 of this and post it alongside. So we'll start with the assessments of risks and benefits, go over the APA principles, and all of that in the next video. All right, see you then.